Building a Life Worth Living in Gambling Recovery, featuring Sal Guarino. What does recovery look like beyond simply stopping a behavior? Sal Guarino, recovery coach, community engagement specialist with eVive, and longtime advocate for gambling recovery, explores that question with us. Sal shares his personal journey from cocaine and gambling addiction to a career dedicated to helping others find hope, purpose, and lasting recovery. The conversation explores the often overlooked connection between stimulant use and gambling addiction, Sal's evolution from a traditional 12-step approach to a more forward-looking recovery coaching model, and the importance of helping people reconnect with their strengths, goals, and dreams. We also discuss how technology can play a role in recovery through platforms like eVive, which provides daily support, peer connection, accountability, and encouragement for individuals looking to stop or manage their gambling. Whether you're a clinician, person in recovery, family member, or someone interested in behavioral health, this episode offers practical insights into how recovery approaches can work together to help people not only survive, but thrive.
This is Talking Addiction and Recovery, the podcast talking, you guessed it, all about addiction and recovery. Join your host, licensed professional counselor Andrew J. Schreier, as he and his guests break down recovery topics with raw honesty, delving into niche conversations around the topics of substance abuse, mental health, and gambling. We intend to meet individuals where they are on their own personal journey of recovery, with dignity, respect, and compassion. We'll do more than talk addiction and recovery. We'll explore it. We're glad you've joined us. Here with today's episode, your host, Andrew Schreier.
Our guest on this episode is Sal Guarino, who is the co-founder of the Recovery Partners and a community engagement specialist with the eVive community, where he helps individuals and families affected by gambling addiction throughout recovery coaching, family support, and long-term recovery planning. After overcoming his own struggles with gambling addiction, Sal turned his lived experience into a mission to help others build meaningful, connected, gambling-free lives rooted in honesty, accountability, and personal growth. Known for his direct yet compassionate approach, he speaks openly about the hidden emotional and financial toll of gambling addiction and the possibility of lasting recovery. To learn more about Sal, visit the podcast notes. Before we listen to Sal's episode, it's important to let listeners know this podcast has grown to become a platform for continuing education. For those of you who may be unaware, licensed and certified professionals are not only required, but often motivated to continue developing their ongoing education in the work they do. This often comes at a cost. Whether it's a price to register, taking time off, missing out on a PTO day, or even travel arrangements, paying for CEUs isn't easy. That's why this platform was designed for clinicians and helping professionals to listen to episodes, take a quiz, complete an eval, and earn a free CEU. To learn more, visit www.andrewjschreier.com. Thanks for listening, and now let's enjoy the show. On this episode of Talking Addiction Recovery Podcast, we want to welcome Sal Guarino. Thanks for joining.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, before we talk about some of the work that you do and some of your experience, can you just share a little bit of a background about yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Well, let's see. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, way back in 1968, and I maybe fit some of the typical Italian-American stereotypes, which I don't mind. It makes it easier to explain who I am. And I currently live in central Mexico. I met my wife during COVID online and then decided to move down here. And I had an early entry into the addictions field as a counselor in my early 20s, way back when, and then detoured out of that for other reasons, worked in business, and then in the last couple of years have kind of re-entered it in the gambling addiction space. And then there's a personal recovery behind all that, but just giving you the kind of highlights.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you had an earlier experience related to addiction and then sort of veered off to a different and then came back to it. How do you explain sort of how that trajectory happens? Because we often don't hear addiction, it went away or veered off towards a different direction, then came back. Normally addiction highlights the main thing about someone sometimes. So how do you explain how some of that journey story happened?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think part of explaining that in different interviews and as kind of it parallels, I think, how I see a lot of the field and my philosophy in it. What I mean is, I had a cocaine addiction in my late adolescence, and also a gambling addiction, but the cocaine kind of came to prominence, and I received kind of classic Minnesota model treatment, 28-day rehab back in the day, and at the time subscribed to the disease concept in the sense that, okay, you probably shouldn't drink or do anything else because it could lead back to that. A position I don't think is so black and white today. But I enjoyed learning about the 12 steps and getting very I really loved them. They made a lot of intellectual sense to me, and it just was like a fish in water. And then, I was in my early 20s, trying to figure out, what to do next, halfway through college. And somebody thought I might be good in that field. So I started working part time in an old school rehab in upstate New York. Um, and then became, back then it was called a credentialed alcoholism counselor. I think I was 21 or 22. So, I got some really good early mentorship and exposure to what was the field back then. Um, was thinking about being a clinical psychologist, but then just got married, had a couple of kids, and life changed. So, but then really, as the years went on, um, I didn't never used cocaine again, with the exception of one time over a gambling relapse, which kind of gives you a little insight. But I um, was kind of your textbook periodic gambler, where I kind of had this almost like affair with it. So every 6 months or 2 years or 3 years. So it's kind of interesting. And I think, back to the point about informing kind of how I look at the field, it's just things don't go in the boxes that a lot of people want to put them in. And maybe at some point I used to try and put them in. So as I thrived in Gamblers Anonymous over the last several years, and then kind of re-entered this field, that kind of explains that loop. But I really feel like I never left it because I always enjoyed helping people. I had some good roots in it for about 10 years, doing in some unique environments with adolescents, with families, and then got into business and different things. But I always was very active in helping people in meetings, and also just kind of at a little different level than you usually do, kind of a mentor, I guess. Or my friends used to say, when I was saying, maybe I'll become a life coach, they're like, you already are. So that kind of thing.
That's fascinating. Like how you describe everything from the Minnesota model and being young, getting started in the profession. Because I started counseling at 19, so I was pretty young too. And as you say, like maybe I put things into a box, and I know I have because I grew up thinking certain things were this way or they were this like that way, and that was
Right.
it. And then now being in the profession for over 20 years, you realize not everything you thought is different, which is great because to me that means you just keep learning more and understanding how things are. There's a something I want to ask you that comes up a lot, and I don't think it gets talked about enough because you mentioned cocaine and gambling, and I don't think people necessarily realize the connection that can be there with stimulants and gambling. And some of the research tells us that there's quite a connection. I've seen it where someone who gives up cocaine then struggles with gambling or picks up gambling. And we know that there's a lot of similarities between that adrenaline or that rush that can occur where sometimes people are like, I can't feel that anywhere else. That's either from like stimulants or gambling, but you don't do that from like bowling or like mini golf.
Yeah.
So, is there anything you can talk about with that? Because I think it's something that we hear a lot about stimulants, and we hear a lot about gambling, but we don't always decide to have the connection with one another. And there's a book I read that was about methamphetamines, and it mentioned gambling, but not in the sense of like a gambling problem or a gambling addiction. It mentioned like gambling with someone who was in jail. It mentioned gambling is like a leisure activity, but nowhere was this, hey, like we should be paying attention to when we're working with certain populations who are struggling with stimulants or they're struggling with gambling. We should also inquire about the other as well. So anything you can share about that because we haven't really talked about, and I think it deserves more attention.
Well, it's funny you say that because I haven't thought about it that much either. But I think for me, just reflecting on it personally, like it kind of both vehicles accentuated my personality, I guess. They kind of played into making me more of what kind of defines me. And the high really from both is really quite similar. I mean, and you know how there are different approaches, but a lot of times if somebody has cocaine addiction or a specific drug addiction, they're going to recommend, maybe no mood altering chemicals whatsoever, including alcohol, which, even at the time, 40 years ago, I didn't really believe it in my heart of hearts, but, I took the caution. I said, okay, well, why risk it? Because the other, marijuana and other things at the time that I went through phases with as a kid, they just really never had the pop that cocaine did or gambling. And gambling was there from the very, very beginning. I mean, literally addicted to Monopoly at age 7 or learning how to play poker as a kid and throwing the chips in for my dad at a poker game. But yeah, it's a good question you raised, though, just to think about that and some of the interplay that it's probably something to probe a little more because it's not off the top of my head, but I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah, it's just something I often talk about. Like if I work with a group of substance use counselors or they work for a substance use treatment program, I know that most people are going to struggle to ask about gambling, right? They're not on
Right.
assessments. They're usually not something that comes up. So one thing I usually say if I'm doing a training or something, I'm like, hey, if you work with someone who's struggling with stimulants, they're diagnosed with like cocaine use disorder, like this is a certain person or population, you really want to try and do like a lie bet screener or just ask about it because of like the connection that there is. So I just kind of find those ways to this is how we can continue to sort of like increase awareness about gambling and ask about gambling uh, instead of just trying to tell everyone to become the gambling experts. But even when you don't treat gambling, you can still ask about it because it can still be really important in affecting that person's treatment and or recovery.
Yeah, makes sense.
So, can you talk a little bit about how when you came back into the work, you did do a lot more focus on gambling. Was there, can you tell us a little more about what either inspired that or what was it that drove you to want to do more work with gambling in particular? Because we know there's a lot of other areas you could have focused on or brought attention to, but gambling seemed to be the one that you have now spent a lot of focus on. Can you share a little bit about the meaning or purpose behind that?
Yeah, sure. So, Adam, who you and I were talking about before, Adam Lyons from the Modern Meeting and from eVive, he likes to call me, the progressive GA guy, meaning it's kind of it's funny because I am a dyed in the wool 12-step GA person. However, what I observed over years, it's been about almost 8 years since I made a bet. And even prior to that, I had a long, steady period in GA as well. So I observed that let me back up even further. I was sold on the idea, rooted really in AA, that this is not a journey of regression. This is not a journey of woe. It's more about the joy of living and some really beautiful things on the other end. And I had some wise mentors who sold me on that in the beginning, a lot like, I believe, Bill Wilson in the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, 1953, after AA was around for 18 years and 14 years after the first text that they wrote. I think he, as a stockbroker and a smart guy, wrote a little more of an intellectually appealing sales book in a way. on the 12 steps and 12 traditions. And I think the people who helped me in the beginning realized, I had a lot of energy, and I needed to be sold on the idea, like, what's the payoff? Because even though it should make sense for us to learn that, hey, if we do these things, we won't continue to step on a rake and have addiction. But I don't know if humans are wired that way, and certainly I wasn't. I needed to know what the prize was. And where I'm going with that is, as I was thriving in GA and doing really well, just from working the steps and going through it and being involved, I noticed most people didn't do that. They weren't really happy. And, I say these things with caution and respect, because it's not about, as you might hear in a meeting, oh, Sal, you're judging people. It's not really that. I'm just assessing them with my two eyes. It's not a moral judgment. The same way that Alcoholics Anonymous asks a lot of people in their meetings, in their basic how it works section, they say, if you want what we have here and are willing to go to any lengths to get it. So what is it that we have? And some of my early mentors said, take a look around the room. Do you want what Frank has? And I'm like, well, honestly? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, not really. I mean, he hasn't gambled, but he's angry. He's really overweight. He smokes cigarettes. And no, I want more than that. And they're like, well, what about Susie? And I'm like, well, she's nice, but it seems like every couple of weeks she's talking about another relationship that just crashed and she's having a hard time. And, it wasn't about better than, it was just, what did I want to really pursue? What were some of the dreams? What were some of the reasons to get abstinent in the first place? And a few of us had made that journey really well. And we noticed a lot of people didn't. And they didn't necessarily go back to gambling. Some did. But I thought it was a shame that they would come through this whole journey and then kind of stop in the middle. So naturally, a few friends and I just started to help people, and they were drawn to us because we kind of went the distance, and we were living in the promises of AA, for lack of a better way to put it. We were happy. I like to say my life was no longer in deference or even in reference to gambling addiction. I was a lot more than that. And I think as much as I love the 12 steps and GA, I feel I have 40 years around it so I can critique it a bit. The same way we need to critique ourselves, we should be able to critique the group we're in. And I think sometimes we get a little too concerned about not fumbling the ball and we stop driving down the field. So as people came and we were helping a lot of people, the idea to start the Recovery Partners, which is really just online coaching, recovery coaching, if you want to call it, came to us because we felt that some of the gaps, there were gaps sometimes in the results of 12 steps and of therapy. And it really is not an attempt to replace either one, because I think that would be silly. But I think for certain people, it can be a really good complement to add some of the forward-leaning tactics. And sometimes they come around in the rooms, but sometimes they don't. More behavioral, more gratitude journaling, more, I call them mission statements. Some people say vision boards or whatever. Asking people day one, hey, what's a dream that you stopped thinking about because of your addiction? Right in the beginning. How has your life been dimmed other than the money and the catastrophes? I call it like a dimmer switch, all the lights go down. What's kind of been lost, and how can we start targeting it right out of the chute? Because I believe that the defense is necessary, the blocks and the meetings and the friction between, the urge and gambling and all that stuff. But I feel like it's really important out of the chute to start looking toward the future, the joy of living, as Bill W. talks about it, the joy of good living. And I think that gets lost a lot of times, not by design in a lot of approaches or in 12 steps, because it's written into it. But human nature, or maybe our own codependency or our own concern about pushing too hard with people. For example, when I first went to a GA meeting many, many years ago, 1986, I was a kid. It was a 3 hour meeting. And about an hour and 20 minutes in before the break, they said, okay, we will now turn our attention to the newcomer, Sal. And they said, please open this book. We're going to read you 20 questions, answer yes or no. What they didn't do, which happens a lot in some sections of the country, not all, is they didn't say, hey, Sal, welcome to the meeting. Later on, we're going to ask you these 20 questions, but don't worry about it. We've all done them. We don't want you to be nervous about it. It's all good, And then sometimes even in meetings, they'll go in a circle and they'll say, hey, Andrew, you answer question one, and then just ask John number two, and John will ask Mary, and it goes around in a circle. Now, why do they do this? Because they're trying to put the person at ease, which is a good intention. But what happens is you lose what I think is a sacred moment of potential awareness. And yes, it is a little bit, I won't say ambush, but a surprise. And you know what? I think that's good because I answered 18 questions. I only answer 19 now out of the 20. And I never really doubted again in my heart of hearts that I had that problem because it was orchestrated in kind of a tough way. So I think that through human nature and the attempt to kind of make it easier for people, we don't want to be harsh, which I appreciate. And there is work to do in that domain also, perhaps. But we wind up losing some of the impact and some of the guts and the kernel of that kind of stuff. So we started to do it, not 12 steps in coaching, but the flavor of looking forward, of being enthusiastic, where in a meeting you might want to talk about the future and somebody might say, take it easy, one day at a time, don't project. And it's like, well, no. I was at a conference in the late 80s. It was an AA conference, and a woman who had 40 something years of abstinence was the keynote. She was 90 something. It was great. And I'll never forget what she said. She said, I define joy as the expectancy of good. Now, it's cool. And you're getting it from your body language because she was saying, look, it's the moment. The expectancy is now. But guess what? She was signaling loud and clear. It's okay to look ahead. And I think that in a nutshell summarizes what I tried to bring with the recovery partners was, hey, what are your strengths? Where do you want to go? What's a dream? What's a dream job? Even if you can never have it. What's something you love to do? What's a hobby? So that kind of energy is what the coaching is about. And sometimes people need a coach, just like anything else. So I'm comfortable with adding that as a compliment because in my own life, I went to years of therapy. It was one of the best things ever. And then I even sought out a coach, which I used to laugh at. I thought it was all says sizzle and no steak. Sometimes it is. But I went to a coach and it was really pivotal at a certain point. So it's kind of a complimentary leg that I was enthused about offering because I felt like people needed to almost get permission to be happy, to augment what they were doing in rooms.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And part of it that you bring up a good point with in a lot of other areas, like if we looked at mental health or family and relationships, if you were to think, if you were to talk about like forward thinking, future thinking, or where do you want to see this relationship in 3 months, 6 months, like that would be usually applauded. Um, and one thing that if you ever work with a marriage and family therapist is when they bring that into a session and maybe they're arguing or they're fighting or the family therapist will be like, wait a minute, this is why we're here is to not keep doing this. We're here
Right.
to learn new things, do new things. And that's just amazing where then in different areas that messaging can be, because I've seen that, I've heard people who had ideas early on in their recovery or treatment or group, and some people like pump the brakes on, whoa, wait till you're a year. And it was like this idea that there was like this formula that really didn't exist. And I think it just you can't apply the same thing just because you hear the same words. You have to really understand like where is this person at? Like what is it that what resources do they have? What resiliency is there? Can they do that? Because some of the very same things that we tell people, well, no, you can't do that until you're like a year into your program. That could be the very same thing that gets them to that year of their sobriety or their abstinence. So I love hearing that because to me, I call myself like a little bit of like a compassionate disruptor where I like to see some of the ways of this is how we've always done it to these are ways that we can do it, which also brings me to a good question of you mentioned GA meetings, you mentioned therapy, you mentioned recovery coaching. There's so many different ways people seek support. To me, I love finding all the new ways and hearing of, to me, why can't a person go to a GA meeting, go to a therapist, have a recovery coach? But sometimes those areas can be siloed or it can seem like they're competing. And I'm like, to me, there is no reason for that. As long as you're not pretending to be something that you're really not, then I'm very supportive of the different tools, resources, treatment that we have available. And you mentioned even treatment, GA, you mentioned therapy, recovery coach.
Yeah.
Why is it that coaching in particular sometimes gets that it doesn't belong in this space? Is that because life coaching way back was more about, the business folks and the how to achieve this? But why is it that coaching is sort of it doesn't always get as much recognition as some of the therapy, the treatment, the meetings? Because coaching is a big thing and it's really becoming bigger in gambling work, which is we need all the help we can get. I don't know if we can be like, hey, sorry, we have enough here.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
any feedback on that with your
Well,
experience?
if I try and be objective, maybe it's because there isn't as much credentialing in the coaching, say, versus therapists. So I think that's fair. And yeah, I think that has something to do. I also think though, we just, I don't know. I think it's human nature. Whatever our leaning is, I won't even call it bias. It might be a bias, but it might not be. It might just be leaning. Like if I take each I don't want to say faction, but each persuasion, right? If you're someone who went through lived experience through a GA, you're going to defend it probably intuitively. You're going to believe in it the same way maybe a fairly devout religious person does in their channel of church or whatever vehicle it would be. Um, and I think it's somewhat natural for someone with education who goes through more of a formal therapeutic, channel to maybe think to poo-poo a little bit of the stuff. I don't, it's like not to open up a Pandora's box, but I wrote a book for fun back in 2018. This is not about plugging the book because I wrote it for fun. But one of the chapters, I talk about the prejudices that I learned as a kid from my family growing up in Brooklyn. And I'm honest about them, about what it was like. I'm not proud of them, but I'm not ashamed of them either because they weren't mine. And I've always had the belief that whatever our biases are, if you could just own them for a second, first of all, and stop pretending we don't have any, and then just own them and try and move past them. So I don't, I think it's okay if the therapist is kind of defending that territory a little and we have to prove ourselves to each other a bit, but we got to be open minded. Because there's like, for example, in GA, which I can speak to best. And, I always had like when I was early exposed to schooling, I got like a one of the earlier drug and alcohol use curriculum degrees back in 1990. It was a 2-year degree, but I learned a lot. And one of the instructors was a pretty hardcore behaviorist. So he exposed us to everything that was anti 12 step to try and, give us devil's advocacy. And he was like, hey, he's like, your higher power didn't do that. You did it. So he would provoke people almost. But he exposed me to a guy named Marlott, who has since died, a professor out of University of Washington. And he talked in his book, a couple of things he mentioned was the idea of abstinence violation effect. When you just believe because everybody tells you if you relapse, this is going to happen. It kind of makes it happen to a degree. He also talked about how a relapse can become a prolapse, and it doesn't have to be this doom that your disease was doing push-ups. And where I'm going with that is, I just think it's good to give us different approaches, but people in GA at times, they just defend it and they think there's no other approaches. And I'm not afraid to say that because I've experienced it. But I've asked them straight on. I'm like, guys, what would happen before 1957? Did anybody ever recover before GA existed? I'm sure they did. I don't know exactly how. Maybe it was through their church. Maybe it was through their spouse. Maybe it was through white knuckling it. I don't know. But I just think I think our field's going in the right direction, though. Like I feel a lot of this kind of synergy, and yeah, in eVive, and I'm mentioning it because it's a good example of this. It's an app, but it's also a community where people are coming in, and we have the cliche, meet people where they are, but they really do. And then it's like, okay, what's the best way to go from here? Why maybe this approach versus another? And I think fundamental to all of them, from what I've seen, is some sense of community. I do think that really is a key part in any of the approaches that we're talking about, even if that community is with a therapist, for example.
Can you share a little bit more about eVive and the work that because I mean, we mentioned before, like Adam Lyons, one of my guys, Christina Cook. I've been a fan of her work and friends, colleagues in this space, but there's also, there's the Dr. Wong, Dr. Haskins is on the board. You've got Sam, who's uh, founder, CEO. You got Michael B, who I've known from this
Yep.
work too. So many people that I've known in different ways, not just through eVibe, but I've known them in stuff that they've done, and now I know a lot of them are doing some work with it. So for people who don't know what it is, can you share what that is, and also like what your role or connection is to it?
Yeah, I'd love to. And to be honest, it is. I've been blessed to work in some great environments through the years, mostly in the beginning of my career in the helping profession, and some other business ones where I was able to inject some of this culture. But I haven't felt as invigorated and as enthused as I do now with eVive. And people who know me know that I don't say those things for points because that's not who I am. So what it is two things. It's an app to help people either stop or manage their gambling. Most people choose the track of stopping. And even a lot of the ones who initially choose the track of managing move over and switch to the track of stopping. So the app itself is good. It helps you track days. It has a lot of resources of different approaches that you can access. It has tools to manage urges and a ton of things. And just a daily check-in, which is simple, but really useful. But I think what's really starting to emerge is the community that's built around it. So I like to kind of jokingly describe it as Reddit, but for people who want to be there. Because when you go to the Reddit threads, understandably, people are complaining and venting, and I just lost 20,000 and my wife wants to kill me and da da da, and then they're gone most of the time. That's no knock on Reddit. It's just what it is. So eVive, you sign up, then you go into the community, and there are layers and layers of people helping each other, and it's growing. So I do community engagement. I reached out to them a few months ago because I liked what I saw, had some great conversations with Sam, and he said, okay, we'll figure out what you can do. In the meantime, just jump in the community. And that's the vehicle that I think is really going to be a good model for the future, because you have moderators like me or engagement specialists who are guiding it. And we're also fairly transparent about our own lives. So it's not, a higher up thing. We're sharing about our own recovery and also guiding and nudging. And we are developing a whole crew of people who are developing their recoveries and helping each other. It's a beautiful thing. We also have several internal meetings. You can invite people from outside eVive, but they're run by people associated with eVive, like Christina with the Broker Society. She kind of partners with them. Adam has his own The Modern Meeting. Sam just started doing his own kind of instructional meeting on Thursdays where he does a topic for 10, 15 minutes. I run one on Wednesday called Recovery in Practice, and I lean it a little more toward action, toward future, toward joy of living. It's not 12 steps per se. It's not. But, I share my experience with that. So it's starting to become, in some ways, I think, the best of all worlds, in that we really do welcome. There's smart recovery in it. There's pretty much any venue, and we try and guide people, and they're getting their own sea legs. And you can start by just watching, posting a little, gently putting your toe in the water till you're ready, which also makes it more accessible. And the fact that at 2 a.m. you can do a post or you can read something. So I like to say to people, it's the beginning of starting to develop a positive relationship with technology in your phone, which is a big problem for us, right? So
But I
I'm
think that
excited
needs to
about it. I think
happen.
I think it's using. I mean, I personally am just tired of hearing about the epidemic and the legalization. I know it's terrible and it's exploding, but there are people fighting those battles. I'm not one of them on the front line. I want to focus on how I can use technology to get better, and how I can use the fact that it's getting publicized to at least give it more exposure and destigmatize it over time, so it can be cool, so to speak, like, going to AA. So yeah, I think eVive is just one of those things, and it's attracting the right people because the core message is good, and because I think Sam and the people that he's bringing are truly open-minded, and we can sit there and compliment each other, but the difference when somebody actually knows they have some ability and an idea, but they really want other feedback. And I think that, from what I've seen in a few months, and I'm a quick read of people, is that kind of defines the organization.
You bring up a good point about it's also helping to like develop a different relationship with your phone technology. And I mentioned this a while ago. This is a little bit different than what we see with substance use because, yes, people can use their phone to actually get substances, communicate to get it, and all that type of stuff. We know like that happens. The fact that gambling over the years was a destination themed place to go to, and now it's a 24/7 possibility in your pocket, that simply telling someone to not be on your phone is not very realistic in most people's lives because their phone is basically also their computer, which is a lot of how they need to do it versus other times where we'd say, hey, like completely be away from it. With gambling, like that's becoming more of a challenge. So I like the connection of that with apps and with the communities that are in the apps and the tools that are there, like it's not only addressing the target behavior is what we call it, right? Like the gambling, but it's
Yeah,
also actually helping to like establish a different relationship with the very same thing that sometimes can be a trigger, can be an urge, can be a temptation. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, and I was going to ask you this, and you actually just started acknowledging it because your approach so far in this conversation is oftentimes when gambling comes up, there's so much talk on what's happening, expansion, lack of things. There is sometimes a doom and gloom of
yep.
what's going on. And I was going to ask you, like, how do you approach all this? Because to me, it seems like you just try to focus on the person and how they're doing or how they're struggling. What can I do to help them? You seem very much on my focus is on the person that is dealing with this, and there's other people who are the ones who are going to try and fight the other battles. But then you came out and mentioned some of this. So it, how do you manage that? Because in this space, we hear that a lot, right? In gambling, we hear so much. I mean, I can go on LinkedIn and every so often there's some article about, what's going on, and you can hear about the industry, the this, the that, and part of it is how do you manage all that going on because it is happening, but it also there are people that currently right now need some support. I feel like I got a sense of how you approach it, but can you just talk about like where that comes from? Because it's not always how it's managed in this area of gambling because of everything going on. And yet you seem to have more of this like different view of how you manage all that noise and deal with all the things that are happening without getting, you know, hopeless, I guess is a great way to say.
That's funny because I sat with Adam and Christina, speaking of which, the other day for the eVive podcast, and they asked their final question is, how do you have hope around this industry? And I didn't know that question was coming actually. And the first thing I said was, well, I think of my life because it's a story of going to hell and making a U-turn a couple of times for one. But then I look at the abilities that we have, like what we're doing right now, okay, is technology. And we're talking about eVive, but it's not just that. We can touch people so much easier and we can be available. I also think, maybe it's a little bit my constitution or optimism or not wanting to fall into a victim stance. And I'm not saying that if we acknowledge the problems that are developing, that's a victim stance per se. But, when I came into steady and firm abstinence, I was single at the time, didn't really have anyone that would have been logical to help manage my money or some of the preventative things that we do. I also didn't gamble as much online. So I know it was a little easier. But my point is, I think I just had to buy into, look, I need to be responsible for this and lean into the potential of recovery versus the difficulty. I couldn't allow myself to think of how hard it is. AAs have been doing this forever. I mean, not that they probably generally go spend a lot of time sitting in a bar, but they have to walk past a bazillion of them and go to a million social events, and they just learn how to do it. And you don't hear a solid person in those rooms too much talking about people's drinking and what they should do. They don't really concern themselves with it. So, I don't know. I just think it's wasted energy for me as a helper to go too far into that. I also think it does subtly sometimes divorce the responsibility from somebody. Like I spoke to a client this morning on coaching, and they were having trouble getting certain apps off the phone and the library and Gamban and all this. And I'm like, okay, we're going to try and work on that. We'll talk to customer service. But, at a certain point, you need to build a whole nother cluster of everything. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's a hard spot because part of like what we do as health professionals is to know what's going on, be aware of what's happening. Sometimes we have to advocate for people that can't advocate for themselves. Sometimes we have to challenge the very same systems that we work in because they're not always set up necessarily with the person that we're helping in mind. And at the same point, also at getting to that point where all of a sudden it's like, well, what can I do? Or helpless, or there's nothing I can do about it. And that doesn't leave us in a better spot either. So I'm always trying to balance that, being
Yeah.
aware, knowing like what can I do? Uh, who can I talk to? What can I say? But then also coming down to what I'm trying to do, which is, provide a safe space for people who are struggling with whatever it is. And that's one of the things that how I continue to carry hope and have that is then with the work that I do with people and then see that it does make an impact, that it can be successful. People do reduce their gambling, stop their gambling
Yep.
entirely. So I just wanted to, as you were talking, it just really piqued my curiosity because it often does get filled with so much of the newest article that came out about something and the newest thing that was happening that grabbed headlines. And for the most part, gambling was very under the radar, very silent. We would be lucky if there was a headline about gambling addiction. Usually there'd be one person who got in trouble for something, and that was
Right.
like the most of it. And now we're sort of seeing quite the polar opposite of so much attention around it that it can feel sometimes like a really, really dark cloud in how we manage that. So I wanted to ask you about that and appreciate your response to sort of how you see that and manage that and talk about that. So that was pretty insightful. Thank you.
Thanks.
So one last question before we wrap up, and I want to know, with what you've gone through your whole life, you've been in some your own story, you've been in some various spaces in the addiction world, and we talked about some of that forward thinking. So when you think about where we are now with gambling and where things are headed with what's going on, what's happening, where do you see or where do you want to be in this? So where are you looking for yourself to be in this work that we're doing now and in the future with gambling, knowing how much you've already sort of been a part of this and your own story going through it as we look forward, which is what we kind of talked about doing. Where do you want to see yourself in this work with gambling? Maybe in the next year or maybe even like 5 years. Can you share any insight with us about that?
That's a great question. And you're asking me what I say I ask everybody else right out of the chute, right? Um, well, it's interesting, and I'll back up just very briefly because I exited the digital advertising business world a couple of years ago for many reasons and started plowing into this one, not really knowing where it was going to go, but believing that if I kept kind of searching, I would find some places, which now I have. So I think the answer is to leverage technology um, to bring more people into the ideas of recovery. And I think, my skill in life and maybe something that I've done in wherever I've gone is trying to connect people and unify, like our conversation, to understand that a smart recovery or a therapeutic plan or a GA have a lot more in common. And let's try and work on not to blend them all or pretend they're the same thing, but let's unify behind that. Let's focus, as we might tell someone in a meeting, on the similarities versus the differences. Um, and a good friend of mine, a gentleman, Brian, who co-founded the Recovery Partners a while ago, he went in a different direction after, but he describes entering into recovery as an on-ramp to something much bigger that has nothing to do with the addiction that brought you in. And I believe that. And I think a lot of the 12-step background goes in that direction. So I see this, not that I want the epidemic, because of course I'd rather not have it, but it is an opportunity for us to do it right. And I feel like even though we're a little bit behind the curve in terms of funding, in terms of awareness and all that, I just feel I like where the energy is. And most of the people I talk to, I feel like it's really pretty unified. So I guess I want to continue to be a voice of connection and also of being comfortable with and courageous enough at times to criticize and to try and improve. I think that's probably the best answer I can give you.
No, I love that. That last part, I think, is that disruption that can be really good, and it's not always a bad thing. I like to cause disruption in areas that I think needs it. I think the shared area is that compassion in that it's not meant to cause harm or to hurt, but it's meant to help and provide safety and connection, right? Like to provide that connection.
We're entitled to be happy. And I think all of us, as whether it's clinician, helper, peer support, you can use whatever word we want, coach, but it's somehow translating that because sometimes all people, but especially in addiction, need to kind of get that reminder.
Yeah. All right. Sal, what's your final takeaway that you'd like to give to listeners? Any final message from our conversation or anything that you've got going on? We'll have ways for them to connect with you to learn more about what you do. But final takeaway from our conversation, go ahead and share.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought the last one was, but no, I'm just half teasing. But I think I'll point this toward someone who is suffering from gambling addiction, and it's hard because there's a lot of different. What do I do? And some people really want to do something. You don't know what to do. And I would say the one thing to do is grab somebody, partner, friend, priest, stranger, therapist, anybody, and tell them what's going on. Honestly. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but if you think of just one person, because I think that's probably the single best thing to do to start to break the isolation and secrecy that is a breeding ground for this addiction. Yeah, and that there is a lot of life on the other side of it.
Thank you so much. That's so important. Well, thank you, Sal, for coming on, talking. Appreciate the conversation and for you to share part of your story, the work that you do, what motivates you, and where you want to see yourself in, this year, next couple of years is going to be very impactful for this work. So thank you for joining and being a part of the podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate the tone and all that we covered in this time. Thank you very much.
One quick thing before you go. If you've gotten value from this show with Sal, from this episode or any other episode, the best thing you can do to support is leave a review on Apple Podcasts. I'm not asking for anything elaborate. Tap the stars, write a sentence or two about what this show means to you. It helps more people in the behavioral health and recovery space find us.
You've been listening to Talking Addiction and Recovery with Andrew J. Schreier. We're so glad you've joined us and invite you to connect further with the show and these topics at www.andrewjschreier.com. That's Andrew J. SCHREIER.com. You can also email us directly at talkingaddictionandrecovery@gmail.com and connect on social media, Instagram at Talking Addiction and Recovery, Facebook Talking Addiction and Recovery Podcast, and Twitter at TalkAR_podcast. To stay connected and never miss an episode, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. Until next time, friends, let's keep talking addiction and recovery.